Yes, and we're on.
I'll introduce our speaker to you all. Jacqueline Proctor has been living at the edge of and exploring the forest on Mount Davidson with her family since 1980. After a career in urban management and planning, she's pursuing her interest in local history and architecture. In addition to creating the mountdavidson.org website and jackieproctor.com blog, she has written 2 books, San Francisco's West of Twin Peaks and Bay Area Beauty, the artistry of Harold G. Stoner architects. She also leads walking tours as a volunteer for San Francisco City Guides, Mount Davidson Stroll, and West Side Whimsy. Please give a warm virtual welcome to Jacqueline Proctor.
Thank you for this opportunity. I have done lots of history presentations and led walking tours in person, and I really enjoy the interaction with all of those who are participating. This is my first Zoom effort, looking at a screen at my slideshow, but bear with me. I think I'll get in the groove. And also, if my internet may drop, please be patient. This is often happening, but we're able to get it restarted really quickly. So let's keep our fingers crossed that technology works with us this day. So thank you so much for coming and participating and listening to this story about Adolph Sutro's forest. Uh-oh, now I got the person. There we go. All right. So Rancho Sutro is famous for the Sutro Baths and the Cliffhouse restaurant. Here you can see the baths and the famous Victorian restaurant, Cliffhouse restaurant. But also up at the top, you see his modest home and the forest he created on Sutro Heights. I grew up amidst the sagebrush and palm trees of Southern California. I was amazed the first time I saw a thick forest growing on Mount Sutro and Mount Davidson in the middle of San Francisco. I had no idea at that time that they were planted by Adolph Sutro. I treasure the fact that I can walk a few short blocks from my tiny row house to enjoy being in the middle of a forest in the middle of the second densest city in the United States. So living here since 1980, and so I'm not a native. I wish I was, but when people ask me, where do you live? And I say Mount Davidson, they say, oh, is that the one with the giant tower on the top? The red and white tower. I say, no, that's Mount Sutro. So here's a street view version of that. And then Mount Sutro is connected to Mount Davidson by Laguna Honda Boulevard, which still has many of Sutro's trees lining the side of it. And then I say I live on Mount Davidson, the one with the cross on it, so San Francisco's highest hill. You can barely see the cross here, but this is the view from Sloat Boulevard as you're coming back from the zoo or Ocean Beach. Sutro's tree planting in San Francisco began with his purchase in 1879 of Sutro Heights. His daughter wrote that trees were planted, fences built, and seeds brought for the garden from all over the world. A conservatory was built and a nursery for young plants was established. A year later, with the money he made from his Comstock Lode mining tunnel, he bought 1,200 more acres of what was called sand lots in western San Francisco. He built a larger nursery for the millions of tree seedlings he would begin planting on his Rancho San Miguel land. So this map shows Rancho San Miguel right here. And at the top is where UCSF is now and Mount Sutro. Mount Davidson is over here. And St. Francis Wood is around here, West Portal. This is Ocean Avenue and where City College is. So I'll give you an idea. So what was the plan for his forest? Harvest them for lumber or save on his taxes? There's no evidence of this, even though it is a common explanation today. What we do know is he donated his Sutro Heights Park to the city. He also welcomed visitors to walk along the trails he built among the forests he created on what is now Mount Sutro and Mount Davidson. So this is Mount Davidson, covered in trees, south to Ocean Avenue, before all those houses were built up to nearly to the very top. Sutro's will restricted the sale of his land until the death of the last heir, with the proceeds to be put into a charitable trust. He didn't specify the charity, but his personal papers and other historic sources confirm he had philanthropic motivations for creating this forest landscape and intended it remain for public use in perpetuity. When Sutro arrived in San Francisco in 1850, no United States city had a public park. But as cities grew in density, the idea of parks was being promoted as a way to foster a harmonious and good society, improving public health, prosperity, democratic equality, and social coherence. So this is what San Francisco looked like when Adolph Sutro bought the 1,200 acres of sand lots out here. And look at, this is the west side of the city, and it looks like a lot of sand dunes. You can see Golden Gate Park right here. And the San Miguel Hills are over here and rather unidentified, because this whole area of San Francisco was called the outside lands. It was inaccessible to transportation. The city started down by the bay where you had boat, the harbor and streetcars and cable cars and so forth. So it was also considered uninhabitable because of the fog and the wind and the sand. Frederick Law Olmstead was a contemporary of Adolph Sutro, and he was a pioneer in creating the discipline of landscape architecture with his design of America's first public park in New York City. Olmsted's motive in the romantic landscape he created for Central Park was recreation, or rather recreation, recreating what was inaccessible to the average city dweller at the time who could not go out to the countryside and the hills and the mountains to enjoy nature. He believed that the contemplation of nature, fresh air, and the change of everyday habits improved people's health and intellectual vigor. Sutro shared this belief in connection of nature and personal improvement from tree-filled landscapes. He wrote many times about a beloved tutor telling him, "My son, live ever near to nature's heart, for to depart from nature is a departure from happiness. Choose thy companions among cherished trees and flowers. The man who loves these can never commit a crime." This was the philosophy that Sutro said he wanted to transmit to those who would survive him. And look at where he grew up. Look at all those trees. And I've been to Germany, and there are thick forests everywhere. And even in the public parks, they have allowed thick forests to grow without being planted in lines or formerly landscaped, just to give the people living in the bigger cities that chance to feel like they're out in the countryside. The parks that Olmsted created became the basis for San Francisco's Golden Gate Park, with naturalistic landscapes designed to foster those four virtues. Sutro's creation of a similar landscape of thick forests on Mount Davidson and Mount Sutro for the Sunday hiker was consistent with these goals. When Sutro started his tree planting in San Francisco, the landscape in Golden Gate Park had been underway for 5 years, but was still more sand dunes than tall trees and lawns. Prior to its creation, city residents were offered private amusement parks such as Woodward Gardens. Sutro created his own amusement park at Land's End, and the first swimming pool in the city opened to the public long before the city built municipal pools. Terrence Young, in his book, Building San Francisco's Parks, writes how San Francisco in Sutro's time was considered a stark environment and virtually treeless. Olmsted describes San Francisco as perfectly bare of trees or shrubs and almost awfully bleak. Olmsted's plan for Central Park aligned with what Sutro wanted to provide for the public on his land, a thick plantation of trees and shrubs that created a visual barrier from the urban environment so locals could experience country scenery near their own homes. Also in San Francisco, the boundary of greenery served as a buffer from the prevailing winds and fogs, especially on the west side. The virtuous goals for these naturalistic and romantic landscapes has now been scientifically proven. Urban trees reduce city noise by 50% or more, provide wildlife habitat, recreational opportunities, improve soil quality, reduce erosion, and help provide a feeling of community well-being. Scientists have found that when people swap their concrete confines for a few hours in forests, parks, and other places with plenty of trees, they experience increased immune function from stress reduction. A study of forest bathing in Japan found that a walk through a forest for a few hours lowered blood pressure. Before Sutro started planting trees in San Francisco, biographer Robert Stewart describes how he created the town of Sutro, the entrance of a silver mine tunnel in the Nevada desert. It included plans for broad sidewalks, tree-lined streets, and 4 parks. According to Stewart, Sutro started developing interest in trees that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He owned a few trees before, but now he saw them as a way to benefit mankind. He planted 10,000 trees and made the sale of lots contingent upon planting a tree in front. Sutro said trees improved the appearance of the town, furnished shade, and brought other benefits. Naturalist poet Joaquin Miller is credited for urging Sutro to beautify his San Miguel Hills by planting trees. In 1886, Miller led the establishment of an Arbor Day tree planting celebration in California. Joaquin and fellow poets John Vancy Cheney and Ina D. Coopworth proposed the event to the Board of Forestry, Adolph Sutro, General Howard, and General Vallejo. The military gave Yerba Buena Island for the purpose. Joaquin's Miller poem, written for the occasion, which he read with much feeling and earnest emphasis on November 27, 1886, reflects his environmental advocacy in response to the destruction by gold mining. I'm not a very good poet reader, but I'll make my effort here. Against our golden orient lawns, we lift a living light today. Thou shalt shine the splendid bronze that lords and lights that lesser bay. Sweet paradise was sown with trees. Thy very name, Lord Nazareth, means woods, it means scents of birds and bees, and songs of leaves with leaping breath. God gave us Mother Earth full blessed. With robes of green and healthful fold, we tore the robes from her breast. We sold our mother's robes for gold. We sold her garments fair, and she lies shamed and naked at our feet. In penitence, we plant a tree. We plant the cross and count it mate. From here where Balboa's waters toss, here in this glorious Spanish Bay, we plant the cross, the Christian cross, the crusade across of Arbor Day. I don't think Miller was talking about Christianity here. From what I read about him, he was very bohemian, just like Ina Coolbrith, as part of the whole poetry scene at the time. But I think he's made it more of as a spiritual and moral imperative. The first tree was planted by Sutro, introduced as the man who had done more than any other in California to advance tree planting, having personally set out 500,000 trees annually for 2 or 3 years. While the band played America, a vast number of visitors fell to digging the soil to plant numerous little sprays of green. The day before, Sutro had hauled 45,000 pine seedlings to be given out to school children to take home or plant on the hillside of Yerba Buena, Fort Mason, and the Presidio. From that day, Sutro was called the father of tree planting in California. Sutro's speech at this ceremony, this Arbor Day ceremony, 12 years before his death, reflects his motivation and plan for his trees. It is my pleasure to plant trees and watch their progress, he said. They are the children of my old age. They will live long after I am laid to rest. A couple years ago, they exhibited a model from the Treasure Island World's Fair, this gigantic 3D model of San Francisco. And this is the section showing west of Twin Peaks. And so there are hundreds of little tiny wooden trees to show Mount Sutro and Mount Davidson here, as well as Golden Gate Park and the Presidio. But it really gives you a sense, this was in 1938, how dense the city had already become. He said, tired people will, I trust, learn to ramble every year in ravine and forest and find renewed health in the presence of the wonderful forests. His daughter wrote that her father modified the harsh climate and beautified the sandy, bare monotone of San Francisco. Sutro has been described currently often as a lumber baron, but he never harvested his trees. His children tried it after he died, and it did not work out financially. So to give you a contrast, here is Mount Sutro covered in trees, and this is Twin Peaks, which doesn't have trees on the top. And that's the typical native landscaping of San Francisco that we'd be seeing today, or it's been covered up with various structures. And so it's very brown most of the year, but Sutro's forest stays green year round. Richard Walker, in his book Country in the City, honors Joaquin Miller as one of California's first environmentalists. Miller's 400-acre property in Oakland was given to the city in 1913. He credits the park as inspiring Bay Area open space and recreational advocacy over the years. He said it was a barren hillside, the original redwood forest having been logged off. The first thing Miller did was to plant pine and fir in the form of an immense cross, so they would be visible from many miles away. So that was Joaquin's billboard for trees across. Sutro received many requests from individuals and organizations for financial help, supplying hundreds of men and women with tickets and food for lodging at the Salvation Army. Mayor Sutro was described as a great good friend of the poor. He lobbied Congress to pass a law to protect the seals off Point Lobos. He promoted establishment of branch libraries and funds for providing work to the unemployed. Long before it became public policy, Sutro proclaimed, "To beautify the city is the duty of every citizen owning property. Tree planting in front of every lot in the residence parks should receive more attention. Gardens in front of houses beautifies the city." In 1895, he offered the affiliated colleges a 26-acre site for a new campus and his library. He said he had reserved this magnificent site specifically selected for its admirable protection against a general conflagration. San Francisco burned down 6 times before it burnt down again in the 1906 quake. That is what he means by conflagration. No matter how much the city may extend, it is well sheltered from the westerly winds, has been planted with trees that form a beautiful grove, and commands a superb view of the park, ocean, and beyond. So what is his legacy? Residence parks inspired by the City Beautiful movement, an impetus for a public park and civic event, and a debate between romantic and rationalistic values in the modern era about what is the best use for parkland. By the time of Sutro's death in 1898, his forest in the middle of San Francisco extended 4 miles from Mount Sutro south to Ocean Avenue. His heirs battled over Sutro's will, and those who wanted to sell his property succeeded in getting it overturned by the California State Supreme Court. So this is an advertisement created by the developers of Ingleside Terraces when the Panama Pacific International Exposition was happening. And the developer of Ingleside Terraces actually built a sundial in this place right here that was dedicated to the opening of the Panama Canal. And what he's showing here is that the West Portal Tunnel is right about here, and it's going to be how easily you can go, all these people coming to the fair from elsewhere can just get on the Muni Metro, which had recently been extended to west of Twin Peaks, and be out in the country with all this wonderful forest and live out in like a suburb of the city. So even here, Sutro's forest is being used by developers to promote selling of their houses. After the will was overturned, developer A.S. Baldwin purchased 724 acres for $1.4 million. You are lucky to find a home in this whole area of San Francisco for $1.4 million today. And Sutro's forest became the theme for the neighborhoods he built there. St. Francis Wood, Forest Hill, Westwood Park, and Westwood Highlands, and then Sherwood Forest. Baldwin also built a trail to the top, through the forest to the top of Mount Davidson for the pleasure of the public. Now, I want you to know a significant contrast here, because these gridded lines here show a plan for building houses by Leland Stanford. He was going to build a Stanford Heights subdivision up to the top of Mount Davidson. This was a plan from the late 1800s. And he was going to extend all the streets in the Mission. So these are like 24th Street, 30th Street, so forth, going all the way to the top. And so he planned this gridded plan, way of doing streets that had been done since San Francisco was first really starting to be built out. But what you see over here are what they call curvilinear streets. And they're much further apart, and they're really following the hills. And this is a new innovation, which I'll talk about further. But meanwhile, the city's highest hill, Mount Davidson, had recently been officially named at the request of the Sierra Club to honor scientist George Davidson for his many contributions as a geologist, astronomer, and naturalist. So no one's heard of George Davidson anymore unless you are a geographer, because he's very famous in geography. He established the eastern boundary of California. He mapped Alaska and encouraged the president to consider adding it to, the United States, and many other achievements, especially in the Pacific Ocean. He pretty much mapped the Pacific Ocean west of the United States. At about the same time, Mount Parnassus was renamed for Adolph Sutro, and it's called, and as it is now. Sutro's trees were incorporated into the neighborhood landscape designs, along with the curvilinear streets I showed you and decorative fountains, as recommended in a 1905 plan for San Francisco created by Daniel Burnham. Burnham had been the architect of Chicago World's Fair and inspired the profession of city planning to help make cities more beautiful and livable. San Francisco residents had a year later fled to the suburbs after the 1906 quake and fire. Baldwin sought to lure them back by creating these suburbs in the city, a detached single-family homes surrounded by greenery and undergrounded utility wires were promoted as safer from fire than the side-by-side Victorians that burned down after the earthquake. Sutro's trees in Forest Hill, in the Forest Hill subdivision, were advertised as providing the quality of life and virtues desired in the public park movement. The ad described Forest Hill as a vast expanse of wooded land, trees swayed by the soft, fragrant breeze from the broad Pacific rolling at its feet. Those of us who live here just call that fog. Beautiful surroundings result in elevated thoughts and better thinking and living. So all these neighborhoods, when they first started selling the lots, kept Sutro's trees as a way to entice people to come and say, oh, don't you want to live here? This is Forest Hill today. More houses and fewer trees, but it's still filled with greenery and ornamental decorations such as this. Another interesting thing is this stairway here leads to Forest Hill Station. So these neighborhoods were transit friendly when they were first created, and all featured interior walkways to be able to walk to Muni Metro, so you could leave your car at home. Noted architect Robert A.M. Stern has recently documented how important these San Francisco residence parks, hard to say, and others all over the world are responsible for keeping cities livable and desirable for families, in his book, Paradise Planned, Garden Suburbs and the Modern City. The sons of Frederick Law Olmstead designed the landscape plan for St. Francis Wood, which is still maintained by the Homeowner Association. It includes 2 large parks and several smaller ones. A grove of eucalyptus decorates the highest hill, with each street having a unique variety of street tree and landscape parking strip. The plan included this decorative fountain and elaborate entrance gate, which led to the Muni Metro, which is down here on Unipacera Boulevard. And you can see the Pacific Ocean out here. Sutro Forest was the last subdivision built up the slopes of Mount Davidson, and it actually abuts what is now Mount Davidson Park. And guess what? What's the name of the main street in Sherwood Forest? Robin Hood Drive. A decade after Baldwin built a trail to the top of Mount Davidson, James Decatur made the climb and wrote, as the group found themselves deeper in the wood, peace and quiet were so profound that it seemed almost unbelievable that the noise and roar of a great city was only a few minutes behind them. The solitude of the forest conveyed a sense of vastness, quite as real as one would experience among the age-old monarchs of the high Sierras. You know, I could have started with this slide because from my experience, and maybe, I don't know, maybe all of you who are watching know where Mount Davidson is, but Most times when I say I live on Mount Davidson, even today, people don't know where it is. And so I think you could put this in the Chronicle today. Decatur's hike through Sutro's forest inspired him to organize an Easter sunrise event at the top in 1923 around a temporary 40-foot high wooden cross. 5,000 people hiked before dawn to welcome the sunrise, and Decatur and Baldwin decided this is worth making it an annual event that continues to this day. But 3 years later, 1926, Mattie Brown went to the sunrise service and started a campaign to save the last of Sutro's forest at the top of Mount Davidson. She went to the Commodore Sloat Elementary School PTA to get a campaign going, and then she got the support of the women's clubs in San Francisco, which had 15,000 members. It took 3 years before Baldwin agreed to sell 20 acres for $15,000 to provide a park for the west of Twin Peaks district and a playground for the whole city. It was stated that the acquisition goal by the city was also to preserve for all time the beautiful tree-covered slopes of the mountain as an attractive scenic landmark in the city. In his Arbor Day speech, Adolph Sutro stated his hope that 100 years from today, the people who inhabit this country will wander through the majestic groves rising from the trees we are now planting. In 1929, 31 years after Sutro's death, a little bit of his forest, 20 acres, was dedicated as a public park on Park Superintendent John McLaren's 84th birthday. So basically, it was the top 20 acres of Mount Davidson. The virtuous value of Sutro's forest is written on a plaque dedicated to Mattie Brown. It says, who found beauty in flower and tree on this lofty hill. Through her untiring pleas, these acres have been set aside as a city park that all may enjoy their beauty and find refreshment of the soul. So that plaque has had an elusive life. And so here is the plaque being replaced in the 1950s. And here it's being replaced in 2010. With more than 30,000 people coming to the sunrise service during the Great Depression, funds were raised to build a permanent cross on Mount Davidson. Before 1934, the temporary sunrise service crosses and events had been on private property owned by the developer. Developer's widow, Mrs. Baldwin, donated 6 more acres to the park to put the new cross on the highest point of Mount Davidson. Over 50,000 people came to see it lit for the first time by President Franklin Roosevelt via a cross-country telegraph line. Now, Mattie Brown is the one who wrote to President Roosevelt asking him to light the cross because of him bringing the golden rule to big business through the New Deal. Also, I think Mrs. Baldwin was excited about 50,000 people coming to the western part of San Francisco. May have never been there before, and maybe they decided they want to live there and buy a house. As houses continued to build up the slopes, 7 acres were added to the east side of the park in 1941 and 5 more on the south side. Now you notice that the east side doesn't have any trees on it. This boundary between Leland Stanford side of Mount Davidson and Adolph Sutro side continues to this day. Stanford never planted any trees. So it's grassland like Twin Peaks and other non-forested parts of San Francisco. 1997, the city was sued for violating the separation of church and state by having a religious monument on public property. The city had to remove the cross or sell the land around it at an auction with no building restrictions. The 6 acres donated to the city park by Mrs. Baldwin was proposed for the sale. Neighborhood activists opposed potentially opening the middle of the park to private development. And succeeded in getting the land area reduced with an open space conservation easement. The Council of Armenian Organizations of Northern California made the winning bid to buy the cross. The sale of public parkland was then subject to voter approval, which passed by 68% in 1997. Now Sutro, he had a plan to put something on top of a hill in San Francisco as well. He put this 12-foot high Goddess of Liberty statue on Mount Olympus in the exact center of San Francisco, and he called it the Triumph of Light. Now that statue is long gone. The pedestal is still there, but it's surrounded by houses. Sutro liked to create giant things, a giant tunnel, a giant bathhouse, a giant forest, and he got a giant tower named for him too. Sutro's nephew, Adolph G. Sutro, had a home built for himself near the top of Mount Sutro in 1935. He sold the house with 5 acres to the ABC TV network in 1948 to build a TV transmission tower. By 1971, they needed one twice as tall. The Sutro Tower we have now is the second tallest structure in San Francisco, but sitting atop Mount Sutro, it is higher than the Golden Gate Bridge. Housing was being built up the slopes of Mount Sutro too, so in 1953, UCSF purchased a 90-acre section of the Sutro Forest to ensure space for campus growth. But at the urging of San Francisco residents, 58 acres was set aside as permanent open space in 1976. A century after Sutro planted his forest to beautify the city and improve the lives of his fellow San Franciscans, his trees are being criticized by environmental groups for being non-native species. Despite significant neighborhood opposition, the city recently designated Mount Davidson Park as a native shrub restoration site. UCSF is also implementing plans to replace Sutro's trees with native shrubs at the urging of the Sutro stewards. At the same time, the forest inspired by the first Arbor Day to be planted on the former Presidio Army base was landmarked for preservation. Head forester Peter Ehrlich wrote that the forest improves the climate by reducing wind speeds, which continually impact trails, roads, and residences. Finally, the historic forest is a contributing factor in the Presidio's historic landmark status. The creators of Golden Gate Park, the Army of the Presidio, and Adolph Sutro all experimented with planting a variety of trees in the sandy dunes of San Francisco. Only the Monterey cypress and eucalyptus survived the sandy soil and were successful in establishing the vertical green wall that could block both the wind and city view. These trees still frame and create the microclimates needed by the ornamental landscaping and provide sheltered areas for park users in Golden Gate Park. Sutro was ahead of his time. With global warming, his trees are helping to moderate climate change by removing tons of air pollution from the atmosphere every year. The number of trees in San Francisco still need to more than double to provide the oxygen needs of its own population. San Francisco's tree canopy is just 13% of its land area. Well, for example, Los Angeles has a tree canopy of almost twice as much at 21%. Much of what Sutro created is gone, but the remnants of the forest he created perseveres as a defining characteristic of San Francisco's highest hills, Mount Davidson and Mount Sutro. These forested trails are still available for the public to enjoy for free and are very much loved by city residents. But they are not romantic tourist attractions like Golden Gate Park that financially benefit the city and are not protected as historic landscapes and therefore subject to ambitious political decisions. What was written a century ago is even truer today. Once on the way, you might imagine yourself in the wildest part of California. The woods appear vast and silent. There is no sign of life along the way, and yet you are still in a city of over 600,000, now nearly 1 million inhabitants, and on every side below you are thousands of closely built homes. No other city in the world offers such a contrast. If Adolph Sutro hadn't planted the trees, would James Decatur been so inspired by his hike through the forest to start a sunrise event on Easter? If there was no Easter event attended by Manny Brown, would she have started a campaign to save the Hilltop Forest as a city park? If the trees had been replaced with houses, would there be any place for native plant gardening? Sutro did not create a funding plan to protect what he created, but the San Miguel Hills would look much different today if he had not landscaped them. Go back, if Sutro had financial motivations to plant trees, why didn't he set up a financial endowment to protect his forest, his library, his bathhouse, or the Cliffhouse? Instead, his papers and other historic sources indicate he spent all of his money for these loves of his life to make San Francisco a better place for its residents. He was a visionary, and like many visionaries, you have the idea, you go for it, but then what happens after is left for others to decide what to do with. So sorry for going so quickly on this. This is part of the challenge for me when I'm not actually looking at anybody and don't have any facial cues or anything like that. So I just sort of get going on it, but I really appreciate your time, and I hope you'll ask questions or clarifications as needed, because I did race through it. If you want to see the full research essay about that I'm referencing in my talk, you can go to mountdavidson.org, and also my blog at jackieproctor.com. And then, of course, as was mentioned, I do pre-pandemic and hopefully post-pandemic, I've been doing seasonal walking tours on Mount Davidson and then the architecture of the West Side. So thank you very much, and I leave it back to the hosts.
Thank you, Jackie. I know that I can't wait to walk around these neighborhoods and Mount Davidson at some point. If I lived closer, I would do it after this talk.